Hello everyone, today we talk about the Milites Christi between the 3rd and the early 4th centuries, observing the essentially non-pacifistic character of the saint, which would sound immediately obvious if you think about their profession and the numbers that we know were naturally present in the Roman army. Something, however, that is easily misunderstandable on the base of a superficial interpretation of certain sources that instead want to stress the non-military nature, at least the allegedly non-aggressive, violent character of the Christian soldier at this time. Naturally, we are looking at the last stage of the anti-Christian persecutions in the Roman Empire, and the affirmation of Christianity not yet as the official religion of the empire, which will happen at the end of the 4th century, but fundamentally as a licit cult, first of all, but also an organization that would rise at the highest political and social niveau at this point. And surely there is an extremely composite picture that emerges from the sources, right? The features of which are difficult to read correctly, even sometimes. It's objectively very subtle and not easy to understand, but just through a bit of perspective and comparison. But this naturally doesn't make the matter less significant at all. So first off, the fact that among the martyrs of the 3rd and early 4th century there's a fair presence of soldiers, which just statistically is noticeable, and this truth undeniable that is, albeit recently subjected to kind of limitations or conditions of various kinds from historiography, nevertheless remains qualifying, right? Many Christian martyrs at this time were military men, and there is no doubt of sort. So the epigraphic testimonies show that the number of Milites Christi that served in the Roman army was relatively large, right? And therefore this didn't also cause particular scandal or silencing, right? It is possible that some of them had voluntarily joined the ranks after converting to Christianity. We don't know. Let's say, to our knowledge, no one has been able to prove the contrary with sure arguments. In any case, there must have been Christians obligatorily, mandatorily called to arms, right? Especially in this time, as we will see, the Roman army transitions from a voluntary to a conscripted one, but we know that, for that matter, there were surely Christians that volunteered in the imperial army. And also, we can phrase it in another, that there are the so-called Egyptian ecclesiastical constitutions, which show converts when they were already in the army. So the latter had to be, in my opinion, the most frequent case, like episodes such as that of the Legio Fulminata, right, the miracle of the rain, that was very famous back in the day during the Marcomannic Wars, and where there was already a, public debate around Christianity, and all claiming there a miracle that saved the Roman legion from annihilation, that the pagans and the Christians were battling over, whose god who had achieved that. But also the testimony of Tertullian that we actually discussed last autumn show that these Christians were soldiers who did all their duty, right? They were fully integrated in the army. They were soldiers like any other. And this can indeed be felt by also the implicit polemic implications of Tertullian's De Corona that we have analyzed, in fact, in the other video, that, if anything, show these guys tending just not to expose themselves too much as Christians. Here we don't have to repeat how the Roman Empire was fundamentally a religiously tolerant one. Of course, there were licit cults and illicit cults. The Christians were persecuted as such for, episodically, right? And not uniformly in the empire, because every governor also fundamentally dealt with the thing as he pleased. And also, we know that the ether, the legal ether was pretty, open, pretty tolerant. It was a civic effort to convince Christians to accept, to sacrifice to the imperial deity, because at the end of the day that was the only thing. Nobody cared, right? The real problem was really the refusal of doing that, and just after multiple attempts condemning the person to death. And that is not even just the point of how it could be, in fact, universally carried out. Most Christians lived perfectly without any imposition, without any problem. They just, at the beginning, of course, were marginated, were a minority. This religion spread among also different social classes that were somewhat marginated already by themselves in the Roman world. But let's say that the dramatic picture of a good or evil, either Christian or pagan, that wants to impose the thing, that it's not a historical reality. It never happened, right? And as we will see better also now. Now, one certainly does not work with imagination when it's believed that for one Christian who preferred to suffer martyrdom rather than stain himself with idolatry, there were many others who chose instead the opposite attitude or were looking for loopholes. Now, alongside the heroism of the martyrs, the Christian society of the 3rd century knew cases such as the one of the Lapsi, that were fundamentally properly apostates that, in order to avoid death, publicly proclaimed themselves to be pagan. The weakness of the Turificati, that were instead those Christians that sometimes were even advised by their bishops to do so at the end of the day, to avoid death, to sacrifice, right, the incense to the imperial deity, and then to atone for that and remaining Christian without problem, because paganism was just a formal, negotiable, contractual act. Nobody cares. It was not a conscience problem here. It was just, however, in fact, nobody cared about that either. So, in theory, you were imposed to do that, right? There was no freedom of conscience properly meant. There was even what was considered the worst, in a way, the libellatici, that were those who actually bought the libellities, documents that witnessed the fact that they had sacrificed, even though it was not true. So they just had bribed the authorities for that. And perhaps in the army, where the pressure and control of the pagan authorities were greater, right, and with them the desire to maintain a career and fear of infamy among superiors and fellow soldiers, acts of surrender, right, to paganism perhaps were more frequent than elsewhere in the Roman world. So it goes without saying that the Christians who decided to sacrifice, by their nature, are destined to remain unknown, right? Probably the majority. And so the persecutions probably, however, prompted. Now we can't talk also why, the revival of persecutions. I mean, here there are deep political rather than religious connections, but let's say they in this phase towards the second half of the 3rd century prompted a number of Christian soldiers to resign from the army, right? However, in cases like this, it was not a question of anti-militarism. This is a point we make today, but of a tendency to disengage from public life in general. This would happen also in fully Christianized societies. I mean, the Middle Ages is plenty of knights that, after a lifetime of bloodshed, decided to retire from the world, become monks and so on. And partly in Roman times here, still in pagan times, in order not to incur idolatry, for sure, partly because of feeling of an alienation from things of the word properly meant. We know that psychologically speaking, in fact, it's a pretty common feeling in certain environments. But we could say that yet the common picture of the martyr soldier specifically was quite another, indeed. These were people who, although converted to Christianity, had remained in the army. So in a formally pagan army, because we made also a video about that, the Roman army had its own religion, it was pagan this time, and they remained so camouflaged, we could say, in the army, as long as they could reconcile professional fate and military condition, right? That already tells how normal or average it was to this possibility, and when it's only when the margin of reconciliation between these two values was lacking, then they suffered martyrdom. This is evident also from the same martyr stories I will see now, that show just apparently an incoherence with this position, because of course they didn't care, in a sense, and even morally, because the point was wholly another. Here we're talking about different sensitivities. The first mistake we incur when we try to tell the story in the sense of Christianity in a pacifistic sense is that people reason to modern categories that at the time were not contemplated, right? There was an embryo of certain morality that we have acquired through Christianity in the sense, but the relation, even Christianity in this sense, is purposely ambiguous because it's pours individual responsibility, right? It is something that it's rarely pointed out, and that actually, in fact, mostly comes out from the most simplistic interpretations of religion, from both religious and non-religious instances, right? Don't think that this is a Christian versus pagan thing. This is something way deeper, even just from a psychological, from an anthropological, sociological point of view that we try to explain now. The martyrs' cases, however, although naturally the Christian tradition has systematically overestimated them, because you know that all this martyrology has mostly come out later, right, from the 4th century, where these saints were now, of course, dead, but I mean from quite a while back in the day. Some stories plausibly invented, but it's not important whether a single martyr ever existed or not. The important thing is that it was considered plausible and normal, and that, of course, we see even reliable evidence of this presence on a consistent scale. So there is no doubt about the concreteness of this reality. Well, say they remained few altogether. These martyrs were just episodically pointed out, right? The same martyrology here, yes, made, of course, I mean, some figures probably were forgotten, and surely there were more episodes than the ones the same martyrology, numerically speaking, offers us. But altogether, compared to considering the number of Christians that were present at the time in every branch of society, including the army, where, of course, it's relatively few people, right? Even the stories do not, they mostly talk about one person, maybe two people together, but not entire, rarely, there is not a picture of mass problems, Christians refusing there, and it wasn't even about the fact of going against the army itself, right, as we will see. But altogether, these episodes are, all in all, rather isolated, right? There is no doubt from the literature, which proves nothing, let it be clear, about the effective spread of Christianity among the troops as we've seen. It proves, if anything, and indirectly, that the fear of the consequences of a decisive gesture was added to the strong solidarity of the body in preventing certain public testimonies of faith, which, on the other hand, as it was noticed already, did not occur except in special circumstances, that is, such as to create a scandal that we know about for this very reason, and increase their intrinsic value at the very moment in which they made them inevitable, under penalty of betrayal to one's conscience. And we'll see what this conscience was interested in, rather. You'd think it was about shedding blood? Not at all. Something deeper. That speaks of a broader, yes, we would say religious, but at that point it's a political coherence, because these people believed that the empire was meant to be Christian in the first place. As it would happen. So the episodes of martyrs in the ranks of the Roman army all seem to date back to the period following the Edict of Decius. We're in the mid-3rd century, which marked a turning point in the relations between Christians and public life, because by imposing the formal act of worship on his subjects as a proof of loyalty, the emperor wanted to provoke explicitly apostasies, not martyrs, because that would go against his unity objective. This thing of the unity of a conquered, let's say, broadly meant, is the same eventually the Christians would use in their own discipline, let's say, even relatively to military matters, desertions, etc., and in times that preceded actually the officialization of Christianity as state religion of the empire. But just when they were actually allowed, when persecutions would stop, fundamentally, as we will see in the early 4th century. So, extremely important, because there is, what I would like to leave you with here is that the pagans and Christians felt basically the same towards things like the empire, towards things like war, right? The exercise, the military service, right? There was something else that made the difference. That may seem more, trivial, and maybe to some would have seemed, or at least they would have not thought it was worth to sacrifice themselves for it. But that made the point that we're trying to search, and that is subtly important. So, the fact that Christian sources, so here we're speaking of essentially of Epiphanius, Cyprian, Eusebius, right? All these record an abundance of martyrs in all areas, therefore also in the army, but not in a special way. If anything, Eusebius says, for example, that the great persecution began the time of Decius right there, that is, from the brothers who were in the army, literally. The initiation of the purge of Christians from the army is a controversial issue, first of all, both for the responsibilities, the related responsibilities, let's say, and for the chronology, because according to Eusebius, it was Galerius that during the war against the Persians initiated this decisive crackdown, say, against the advice of Diocletian, that, as we know, instead actually issued Christian persecution itself. In the aforementioned case, however, the alternative presented to the soldiers was that between formal sacrifice and resignation from the ranks, right? They were reluctant to resort to more severe punitive measures against the Christians. The proposed year by Eusebius is 298, and it seems that the investigation into the loyalty of cadres, which in the final analysis was concerned only the officers, by the way, not even the troop. Lactantius presents instead the matter in a different way, because he traces the order of mandatory service in the whole army to Diocletian, showing that it also involved the troops altogether, and he dates that to 301. Then, with the great and general persecution of 303, even in the army, there was a heavier pressure, let's say. And however, in this, two facts are clear. First, the measures concerning the hunting, let's say, of Christian soldiers concerned more the east, right? Naturally, where Christian penetration was more massive than the West, where instead it practically did not constitute a problem. Secondly, the drastic imperial measures alone demonstrate, and precisely with their drasticity, that the Christians present in the imperial ranks should have not been many. Otherwise, one would have risked in a political moment like that to measures that could have repercussions, making the army collapse, and that the authorities in particular knew they could count on the discipline of cadres and police forces. However, it is difficult to establish a phenomenology of martyrdom in a military environment. There were cases of extremely cautious soldiers who only if cornered would reveal their fate, right? And there were cases also of extreme audacity, generally coinciding with solemn occasions, more likely to make the testimony acquire even a public meaning, and moreover considered morally not advisable by Christians themselves. Right. Likewise, on the pagan side, conciliatory understanding officers and officials alternated with rigidity and severity, whose excessive zeal made the situation worse. In any case, the acta martyrum demonstrate how fallacious the cliché of the Christian hero and the perfidious pagan is. The clash is actually between the Christians' pietas and the pagans' impietas, right? So, if you want, along the pattern of a formal, yet, very meaningful distinction, not between virtues and vices of the antagonists of this or that episode, and it's very important from a moral point of view, because instead, of course, the stupid modernistic attitude to these things is, oh, those guys were evil, those guys were good. A person who reasons like this, I don't know if it has some mental problem or what. Anyhow, furthermore, the episodes of military martyrs, significant in the ideological sense of the term, are very few, right? And also with a lack of homogeneity that reflects the state of indecision and disorientation among the faithful in Christ regarding the attitude to be taken regarding war and military discipline. A good soldier, fully integrated in his condition, must have been that Marinus, who in 260 served in Caesarea of Palestine in the legions of Gallienus. Indeed, he would have reached the rank of centurion if an envious fellow soldier had not denounced a lack from his side, a fault from his side, the only one, right? Perhaps towards the military discipline. That is, he did not sacrifice to the emperor as a Christian. So if in addition to this he, had made himself guilty of something else, or had been susceptible to being accused of it, such as pronouncing himself against the profession of arms or the practice of fighting, for example, there is no doubt that the malevolent colleague would have not kept silent. Right? The denunciation was even like a thunderbolt out of the blue for Marinus' superiors, who evidently esteemed him and were fond of him, and who perhaps were formally forced, actually, legally, to the denunciation to open their eyes only now on something that they actually knew very well for some time. So Marinus was given 3 hours to reflect, allegedly. So he went to his bishop and asked his advice. The latter, in response, lifted his cloak and pointed to the gladius that hung at his side, while showing him the Gospels in the meanwhile. So Marinus understood. He returned peacefully to court, reaffirmed his faith, and faced the torture. So it is clear that until then Marinus had found himself well in the army, and that he had been able to perform his duty as a Christian and as a soldier at the same time. He was making a career, and evidently he cared about it. Was he a lukewarm Christian willing to the last to compromise with his own conscience, and that only in the face of denunciation and danger had he unexpectedly displayed a firmness of character hitherto unknown to himself? May also be. In any case, once he was at the crossroads and invited to choose, he knew how to do it consistently. Now, it would be strange that such a man, precisely because of the weakness and humiliations that are glimpsed facing in personal experience up to the fatal moment, had never reflected before on the irreconcilability between the sword and the Gospels that the bishop had made him laconically point out. Right? And strange is also too that the latter, after all, had not pointed this out to him earlier. Right? So what's the explanation, actually? Well, it's clear, it's simpler than it is. The fact is that in this context, the gladius will not, it doesn't have to be understood as a weapon, as an instrument of death, right? Nor will its irreconcilability with the Gospels reside in this. It was rather, at that time, the symbol and badge, let's say, of military profession. That is, soldiers, uniforms as such did not exist. It was the cingulum militaris that made the difference between military men and civilians. So, it's this symbol that became objectively in contrast with the faith. Why? Because the condition for its maintenance by Marinus was apostasy, right? So, with his gesture, the bishop did not intend to indicate an incompatibility between being a Christian and fighting, especially since this would have made little sense in an area so close to the theater of the war against the Persians. So he only intended to point out the impossibility to further reconcile religious duties and the military ones in that particular soldier, in that particular situation, when he was forced to decide between one and the other. Right? A clear case, the only clear one, after all, let's say, of conscientious objection seems to have been the one of another soldier, Maximilianus. Now, he presented himself in 295 at Taveste in Africa, accompanied by his father for enlistment. This because, he was the son of a legionnaire, right? This constituted his, as most Roman army, civil military commitment, both a right and a duty, a munus, we would say. So consider that the obligation made to the sons of veterans to serve in the army seems to date back to Diocletian, in line with the world policy aimed at preventing desertion from certain professions or trades, as typical of the late empire. So the young man, Maximilianus, tore the lead saeculum with the effigy of the emperor from his neck and repeatedly bursted into passionate declarations, such as "Mi non licet militare quia Christianus sum. Non possum militare, non possum male facere. Christianus sum, non milito saeculo, sed milito Deo meo." Right, so these are very explicit statements. So he says, to me, it's not licit to serve in the military because I'm Christian. I cannot serve in the military because I can't do wrong because I'm Christian, simply. I don't serve the saeculum, but my own God. right? And we'll see now what this thing means. So the proconsul reminded Maximilianus in vain that even in the imperial Sacer Comitatus there were Christians who carried out their duty without problems as soldiers, right? And Maximilianus replied, let them do what they want, as far as, they do no harm, especially this last line, which sounds implicit condemnation for the weakness of soul, let's say, of his co-religionists, seemed to derive from his firm, painful personal awareness. That is, if there are those who think they're doing well by professing the faith and at the same time remaining under arms, so much better for them. But if they think differently, must behave accordingly. That's another thing. So somebody says, this is a typical case of conscientious objector, right? Others came out with something more articulated, and some even excluded proper that in this episode a phenomenology of an objection of conscience ante litteram, we could say. So let's compare Marinus and Maximilianus. So respectively the veteran on the verge of becoming a centurion and the forced recruit. So they're very different from each other, aren't they? But they both suffered martyrdom. So if Marinus said his no only when faced with the prospect of abjuration, what was the motive for Maximilianus' refusal? Because he said, as we've seen, non possum militare, he said, I can't serve as in the military. So the objection is quite otherwise radical than the refuse to kill, but rather invests the substance of the military discipline. Non possum male facere. I can't do wrong. I can't do bad things. And the military condition, therefore, seems totally sinful to this young man. Not only when, or specifically when he goes into battle, or when he kills somebody. He says serving the military. Right? So the military is felt as such as a malevolence. Maximilianus does not make reservations about killing, as we've seen. It goes to the substance of problem, throwing away the imperial saeculum. Right? And this actually demonstrates an aversion to the idolatry, the same mold, we could say, as that of Marinus, but in a much more coherent and consequent way, we would say. It's not a question of a conscientious objection in a modern sense, but of literally non habebis deus alienos coram me. Right? You shall not have any other god out of me. Hence, you can't recognize the imperial one. What's all that about? It's not about the military exercise. It's about the fact that that military was pagan, right? And it imposed to conform to it, which for a Christian was not acceptable, at least in this extreme stance. So, a yet different case, but which converges in the usual anti-idolatrous, let's say, motive, is that of Tipasius, who is more or less a contemporary of Maximilianus. So, here we are in Mauritania. Tipasius is a veteran who, having performed his duty in an irreproachable way and obtained his leave, retired to a life of contemplation. Now, it's not clear whether the conversion was the reason or not. In any case, it was prior to his leave. In 297, Maximian called this Miles Christi back into service. And Tipasius chose the occasion of the Donativum. It was a big deal, not just because of the pay itself, but because there was the imperial celebration in the meanwhile, to refuse the service. But But the same Tipasius, in this refusal, announced to the victory of imperial armies by the Archangel Gabriel. So you understand that he refuses military service, but he actually saying, Gabriel Archangel is going to make the Roman army win. So Tipasius is anything but an enemy of the army, because this has the Roman army will win thanks to God, right? Nor he is indifferent even to the destinies of Rome. So Gabriel's prophecy cheered him up, and by divulging it, Tipasius wanted to prove once more that Christianity was not against the empire. Maximian, who first had him imprisoned, realizing the accuracy of the prophecies that came true, because the Romans won, freed Tipasius. And even more, he publicly congratulated him, again granting him his leave. Now, this is not over, because after some time a new call and a new refusal from Tipasius happened, where he stated, literally, ego saeculum vici, Christo milito. Which means, I won the saeculum, and I serve God. I serve under God. And how he defeated the saeculum? He disobeyed the Emperor Rome, who was obliged to recognize that he was free again to leave. So, of course, he won the greatest military authority on earth, because imperial glory, doesn't matter whether you're pagan or Christian, always comes from God. This is a universal language. It's always the same thing. No army, no man can win without God, both for pagans and Christians. The symbol of the empire is the symbol of the God of the skies and of military glory, right? But he won this. He won the saeculum, right? This the emperor as earthly authority, because he had served under Christ. That is, the challenge had took on a military character, if you want. It is not denied, it's not refused. That has a value that, in mentality of a late Roman, military man or not, was how the word was normally read by any other people. That is, I want that glory, because I literally refused what the emperor asked me, and I got away with that. This can't happen without God, and I was able to do that because I was serving God specifically. But at this point, he was imprisoned again, and his obstinacy in not returning to the army and in not wanting to sacrifice to the gods caused literally a riot. A military riot, a tumultus militaris in the source. So it is the indignation of the soldiers here that were clearly harmed, more than in their religiosity, in their esprit de corps, let's say, that induced at this point, because the army was still pagan. So this was a big deal. How dared here? So the praeses of the Legio Caesariensis sent him deeply reluctantly to torture. You see, even the highest authority in the local military there, brought him to torture, but he would have not done. We don't know why, but evidently wasn't thought of as a great thing. But the freaking army was mutinying, so he had to do that, and that tells you also the pragmatism, the obviously political cause of anything that happens in the world. I mean, is it religion? Really, it was caused by this individual for religious reasons, but this guy had to take essentially a political decision because of this religious matter. And it had, of course, a political meaning. So, shortly after, at the beginning of the 4th century, there is a case of another veteran, that is Julius. Now, this occurs in Mesia, on the Danubian border. So this guy was a freaking war hero. Like, he had served 27 years in the army. He had went through 7 campaigns. Right. He also refused to sacrifice. And he, too, was executed according to the provisions of the edicts. Now, and here, we are perhaps in front also of the most famous case. That is the one of the centurion Marcellus, of the Legio Septima Gemina. This happened in Tingis, 298. Right. So the guy was shaken by the religious fists linked to the imperial cult, and he threw down the insignia of his rank, declaring himself Miles Christi, and refusing to serve further in an army that worshipped gods of wood and stone. So we do not know whether this rejection of the Sacramentum Castrensis, let's say, which costed him his life, by the way, depended on a fate that at this point was no longer being hidden, or that he had just embraced. For example, we do not know whether the circumstances of the public profession of faith on a particularly solemn occasion is the result of a programmatic choice, as some would like to spot a bit for old military martyrs, but there is really no evidence for, or rather of an unreflective act, right, carried out under the pressure of ardor, of indignation. Now, the fact is that the occasional, but perhaps also substantial cause of Marcellus' gesture lies, no less than in other cases, in the refusal to become an accomplice in an idolatrous ceremony. What this has to do with actually being a fighter? Zero. They couldn't care less. Here, the only problem we can spot is the idolatry problem. The fact that they had to sacrifice to a god that was another one from their own. And the list could go on. There are Cassianus Tarachus martyred in Arzarbus, for example, in 304, when already discharged had refused to sacrifice. The Vexillifer Fabius, Marcianus and Lycandrus in Mesia, also firm in rejecting acts of idolatry. Decius, who in Durostorum in Mesia in 304 did not want to participate in the Saturnalia. Similar again, the episode of Genesius. Now, the hagiographically speaking thorny case of the martyrdom of the Theban legion offers in the version provided by Eucharius in the 5th century, so much later, and in fully Christian times, a very interesting element. So here the soldiers, that is, would have refused to harm their brothers in Christ, while they would have said they were ready to fight against the enemies. So basically here we have an acceptance of duties towards the state, that is Christian, with Christian army, Christian soldiers, the acceptance of duties toward the state, therefore, found in them, these soldiers, the only stumbling block of solidarity between believers. They were absolutely fine killing other people as soldiers, because that's all what a soldier does and is conceived for, because otherwise we would find other ways. But of course they refused to shed their co-religionists' blood. So the increase in the number of episodes involving military martyrs as protagonists as we progress into the Diocletian age is not enough in itself to make us think that the persecution weighed mainly on the army, or that there was a particular higher density of Christians than elsewhere. Right? We notice it, but we're not sure. Perhaps everything lies in the fact that the soldiers were more easily controlled by authorities, right? And that in a militaristic state, like the one that was being created in a delicate moment, by the way, like that of the Tetrarchy, their insubordination caused more sensation, right? This was a moment of tightening the grip a bit all over Roman society by the side of emperors were ever more military in character, in activity, in background, and were, ever more controlling society and imposing a new order, right? So not all the Christians discovered were martyred either, right? Their superiors, according to the Acta Martyrum, generally behaved anything but inflexible persecutors. Indeed, they often showed amazement, pain, sometimes understanding, and a tendency to compromise. They did not want to lose good soldiers, which Christians evidently were, because otherwise what would they have cared about? It's not that a person's life costed much at the time. And probably when the attitude of the accused was not configured as serious insubordination of crimen lese majestatis, the matter was silenced, or at least smoothed out with expulsion from the army, a provision that was in itself punitive, ignominious. It was a tragedy, actually, for the guy's honor, which will have weighted, in this sense, perhaps more than death itself, on the hearts of men who had spent most of their lives in the army. And in a moment in which Roman armies were pretty damn active. But by that point, there were too many Christians in the castra and outside, right? Galerius himself understood this when, on April the 30th, 311, issued the first distensive edict. From all this derived a lot of significant data. First, at the dawn of the 4th century, the Christians present in the army were in good numbers, and they were good soldiers, which means that, except for some author of a or extremist milieu, they did not at all judge military service incompatible with their religious position, nor was there an education to this effect on the part of thinkers and the ministers of the cult. That is, the church was fine with that. Second, the fundamental cause of the scandal for the Christian in arms was the idolatrous cult, as we've seen. If this obstacle was removed, the major cause of friction between military status and the profession of Christianity would also have been removed. This situation was certainly well understood by he who at the end of October 312 imposed the celeste signum, the cross, or perhaps the chrismon, as a badge on his legions, making those military insignia the cult of which he had hitherto been the object of horror for some of his soldiers, a legitimate object of veneration. Now, there has been definitely too much said on the adoption of Christian symbols as a military insignia by Constantine. What makes it worth repeating in here is simply that by this means he obtained that signia and vexilla were for all his soldiers what they had been since the early days of the Roman army, these sacred objects, worthy of veneration, considered loads of a kind of arcane terrible power. At the same time, Lactantius reports that the victory of Licinius over Maximin Daia was assured to the former by the visit of an angel, who commanded him to pray with the whole army to the Sanctus Summus Deus, in order to ensure that success was granted to his arms. Now, it is true that experiments of this kind by the emperors who sponsored them were actually part of the old tendentially anatheistic, basically monotheizing syncretism of the imperial cult. The Licinian and Constantinian expression of God Supreme, God One, God the Savior, do not fit the Christian God better than the Deus Sanctus Sol, the Sol Invictus. But now, with this, Christianity too was religio castrensis, right? According to Eusebius, Constantine would have had at sunset, famously enough, on the day before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the vision of a radiant cross in the sky, accompanied by the inscription Tuto Nica, in hoc vince. During the night, Christ would appear to him in a dream, ordering him to adopt the symbol in the battle of the next day. According to Lactantius, the Signum Celeste was applied to the shields. We would be dealing here with the monogram de Chrismon, Christos Pantocrator. But the text is not entirely clear. Now, after what is used to define the Edict of Milan of 313, by now there was no longer any fear that Christian soldiers were obliged to carry out acts contrary to religious conscience. Right? By the way, the original version of the edict, that was essentially a replication of Galerius I in the West now, we know from Eusebius, his Historia Ecclesiastica is missing, though. While instead not converting to Christianity or ever renouncing to the title of Pontifex Maximus, Constantine accurately grasped the breaking point in relations between Christians and the empire, as well as the way to make it a strong point. After all, paganism, especially that practiced in the encampments, has for some time been turning towards monotheism. Roman paganism, in Constantinian times, is definitely not Roman paganism of Caesar's time, not the one at the time of Scipio, So the conversion of the empire was largely, at least at the beginning, the result of a mutual attraction of Christianity and the solar/imperial paganism. If, therefore, Licinius, and even more Constantine, favored the Christian church so much, it was on its part quite otherwise than unavailable, while on the one hand Christians no longer had to fear the imposition of abjuration as a condition for taking up public offices, on the other, the increasing, now official and uncovered, weight of Christians in public life obliged the church to assume civil duties and responsibilities that had been previously unknown. Right? The year following the Edict of Milan, in 314, in Arles, southern Gaul, a council meeting to decide on doctrinal and disciplinary issues, that was the Donatist schism in Africa, was in progress, decreed, among other things, in the third canon, quote, Deis qui arma proiciunt in pace placuit abstineri eos a communione. Now, this phrase, albeit very simple in Latin, is difficult to properly translate because of the semantics involved. In fact, scholars have been a bit tormented in its criticism. It's been said that the expression, the arma proicere, does not mean to throw down your weapons, but rather to use them. and more specifically against someone, because that's how you proiches, technically the thing. So it was thought that even that pax was the effect of copying error, fundamentally. Now, the hypothesis has been advanced that the canon wanted to allude to gladiatorial fights, prohibiting them. An attempt was made to fully exploit the distinction between bellare and militare, which is two different things. That is essentially to fight proper and to serve in the military, essentially. To deduce that the canon, while admitting the presence of Christians in the army in peacetime, forbade it in war. In other words, they wouldn't have to shed blood. Now, it seems to us instead that given the need basically underestimated by historiography to read this canon in the constant context of a council that was above all anti-Donatist, right, there can be no doubt that it should be understood as a decision to impose excommunication to all Christians who, in time of peace, deserted or refused to submit to military discipline. Right? That is, this is not against Christians actually using arms against someone, but literally those who didn't want to participate to the army. It would make them deserters. There are very few doubts about the legitimacy of translating arma prohibere as to throw down your arms. And as far as understanding of, let's say, for the understanding of peace as opposed to, let's say, an implication imbued in order to deduce that the council allowed Christians to serve in peace but not in war, right? It is a question of that the thesis risk only theoretically. Undoubtedly, such positions had existed in the Christian world from the Egyptian constitutions, for example, we mentioned before. However, in practice, quite a few conditions had changed since then. Christianity had just emerged from persecutions now, and had also come out of it thanks to the contribution of Christian soldiers and the victory that the Christian God had granted Constantine and Licinius. So how can we hypothesize in a church that is now so close to political power and willing to collaborate with it, and even more radical positions than that of the martyrs who came to throw down their weapons only if constrained by the need not to commit idolatry, right? The most balanced and correct interpretation, therefore, seems to be that which intends in peace as a qualification of the state of detente that occurred between the empire and the Christian community after the Edict of Milan. To the benevolent disposition of the first, the second responded with a desire for collaboration. The fact that there were Christians who consider it lawful and perhaps meritorious to desert, the very existence of the canon seems to prove it. But it also proves that these were groups that were strictly intended to marginalize. Is it worth pointing out that what extent that fault was considered serious if excommunication was imposed on it? Councils at that time were pretty still kind of spontaneous, right? They had their own, they were yet to be framed under the rigid imperial code. This is what Christian bishops were doing altogether, with evenly support from the side of the Christian community altogether. After the Arlesian decisions must be read complementarily to those canons 22nd and 23rd of the Council of Elvira that had been held a few years earlier. Now, these canons established penalties against Christians guilty of voluntary or involuntary murder without mentioning the possible condition of the offender. Now, could this mean that whatever the circumstances of the murder, it remained a thing worthy of punishment in any case? the opposite is more probable. That is, there was no mention of the Christian engaged in military functions precisely because the actions carried out in war and under higher orders, especially, were discriminated against from those carried out under full individual responsibility. Now, it is also true that the 12th canon of the Council of Nicaea, 325, prescribed very harsh sanctions against those who, quote, touched by grace in a first outburst of zeal, proclaimed their fate by laying down the saeculum militaris proper, and then, like dogs, they returned to their vomit, sometimes resorting to corruption in order to be readmitted into the militia. Right here can translate saeculum militaris and militia, even though the canon is in Greek, right? But there is the Greek correspondent to it to clarify what we're pointing out here, right? You understand that this is basically against those who had first abandoned the military and then wanted to come back on, and it sounds something negative for Christians. So is it against military service? No, not really. Seemed to be oriented in a diametrical opposite direction to the Arlesian canon third, right? But with regard to it, and this is just why history is important, and we should always contextualize, the Nicene canon referenced to a particular case that has been ascertained. It was that of Licinius soldiers who had taken their leave when they had taken an anti-Christian attitude, but who later tried every way to return to service. That is, first, you're against Christians because now they're integrated in the army. You go away from the army, now you want to come back? So this sounds very differently from before. And of course, here we're talking about Christians that are fully integrated in the army and more, right? There is a church that is fine with that even considers now pagans abandoning the army because it's Christian. That, after all, serving in war was now considered no longer only lawful, but even meritorious, is demonstrated by a letter written in 356 by the Bishop of Alexandria Athanasius, who spoke of it as something in the public domain and currently accepted. That is, it is not allowed to kill, yet destroying enemies in war is legitimate and worthy of praise, so that the same act is forbidden if it is considered from a certain point of view and it is performed out of place, while it is normal and permitted when it is considered from another side and it is performed in due time. What more appropriate comment on the intimate coherence, indeed complementarity, between the decision of Acla and those of Elvira? Still, on the level of canons, much more confident in understanding the official positions within the Christian community than the most insightful passages of the most authoritative authors, it should be noted that both Canon 83rd of Book 8 of the Constitutiones Apostolicae and the 7th of the Council of Chalcedon, much later on, but still meaningfully, are in agreement in forbidding those who belong to the clergy or have become monks to perform military service or accept civilian positions. Now, it's important that the 7th canon of Chalcedon entered the Corpus Juris Canonici, right? And as we've said, the Chalcedonian canon is, of course, from 451. The other is, according to some, slightly earlier, according to others, slightly later. But anyhow, what does this mean? Well, this means that by establishing an exception, it implicitly confirms the rule according to which military service was, for the laity, completely legitimate. It was just the clergy was excluded from it, and the Constitutiones Apostolicae had already indicated in the well-known passage of Luke, the nucleus of the teachings to be imparted to the catechumens of military status. What in the gospel text was a lesson of humility and modesty had become at that point a deference to the power of the state. With Chalcedon, then, there was already a climate that surely differed much from that of Constantine's time, and more favorable to collaboration between the church and the empire, and the presence of Christians in the army, also because the empire was Christian now, and favorable, not to say necessitating. After the storms of the 4th century, Christianity was surely the new state religion. Meanwhile, the barbarians pressed so that the destinies of the true faith, right, and the spirit of Rome seemed united and besieged by a single danger. And then, there had already been, but today we won't talk about that, with Aurelius Augustinus, a first great theoretical arrangement of the problem of war. And we also made a video, by the way, about Ambrose of Milan and the creation of a Roman Christian imperial consciousness that is connected to this as well. I think this was clear enough, well evidenced, and that hopefully will, expand a bit more of horizons of those who believe that fundamentally this is just a struggle between Christians and pagans, or this is just, about being good and evil, and starting to reflect instead a little bit more on the actual meaning of religion, and especially its connection with individual conscience, but also collective duty, the one of society, and the respect for authority that is not there placed by, anyone, but by God himself. And always remember that this universal power was always conceived since before. So we're talking about these Christians. They popped out like mushrooms from nowhere. These were former pagans in a way or another. The word came from that. They all believed the same freaking things, and even as Christians, they actually identified the same imperial glory in the divine power and authority. It was just a different sensitivity that would bring a shift from essentially freedom of cult to freedom of conscience, and an inversion from the respective, let's say, persecution, but at the same time making, I think, a step forward in the double thread relation between the state, the individual, and the moral problem indeed posed by bloodshed that, however, is considered at this point necessary, as in every society, to defend, not only broadly meant, the state and the community. Alright, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.